Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Black Law Student Association and the Center for Civil and Human Rights, first and foremost, because if it wasn't for them, it wouldn't be possible. So to the main event. The person standing next to me is a people's lawyer through and through. She is a graduate of University of California, Berkeley, and University of Michigan Law School. She has over 34 years of civil rights experience as an attorney. She is a current partner of their own firm, dealing mostly with civil rights and other issues related. She's a current vice president of the Detroit, Michigan National Lawyers Guild. She is also a board member of the Michigan Coalition of Human Rights. So give it up for Julie Hurwitz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you here this afternoon, and I want to thank Rashid especially for maintaining his contact with me. You know, he was a law clerk at my office last summer, and his dedication and commitment to social justice issues is just really something to be commended, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here this afternoon. My talk this afternoon is called Water, Race, and Accountability. And right now in the state of Michigan, we are facing an unprecedented crisis with water as the weapon in both constitutional and political accountability. And it is a message that I think the entire nation is now finally starting to recognize through the extreme results that have occurred in Flint. And so what I'm going to be doing this afternoon is talking about how the story in Flint is really part of a much larger and historical context. So you can't really understand the water crisis in Flint without understanding the crisis in government, the crisis in democracy, and the crisis in our Constitution that is playing itself out right now in the state of Michigan. Last week at the University of Michigan Law School, there was a symposium on civil rights. And one of the guest speakers was Vanita Gupta, who's the head of the Civil Rights Division for the Department of Justice. And in her speech, she made a very profound statement that I thought was worth sharing with you to start this talk off. She said that in communities across America today, from Ferguson, Missouri, to Flint, Michigan, too many people, especially young people and people of color, live trapped by the weight of poverty and injustice. They suffer the disparate impact of policies driven by, at best, benign neglect and, at worst, deliberate indifference. And they see how discrimination stacks the decks against them. I now represent the community of Flint, Michigan in 3 separate class action lawsuits, and we are going to show that this was not benign neglect. This was deliberate indifference at a minimum. Before I get to Flint, however, I want to just share with you a quick chronology of what has been going on in Michigan since Rick Snyder, a very nice guy, but an extremely right-wing Republican, since he took office in January of 2011. Within months of his assuming power, he, with the backing of a large pro-corporate Republican majority in the Michigan legislature, enacted what's called Public Act 4. And it was the first in a series of extremely frightening and draconian assaults on democracy. The emergency manager law in Michigan, there has always been, and many states have, emergency manager laws. No other state, however, has a law that expands the scope of dictatorial power than the Michigan emergency manager law does. Most emergency manager laws limit themselves to exclusively financial issues. And before Public Act 4 was enacted, we had what was called an emergency financial manager law that allowed the state in communities that were experiencing crises, financial crises, to appoint someone to oversee the finances of that community. That was bad enough. What the emergency manager law, PA4, did was expanded the power of the executive branch to appoint one person to go into a community or a school district and assume all governance power without any accountability to its constituents or to anyone but the governor. Emergency managers are now allowed to go into communities, break union contracts, take over all local control of every aspect of governance, repeal local ordinances, repeal city charters, and enact laws just unilaterally without any semblance of legislative or democratic process. So immediately after this law was passed, a group of social justice organizations and progressive attorneys got together in June of 2011 and filed a Michigan constitutional challenge to this law. Between June of 2011 and November of 2012, while we were litigating the constitutionality of this law, and we were prevailing in our efforts to obtain the discovery that we needed to prove that what had occurred was not in compliance with constitutional principles, there was a groundswell of mobilizing and organizing on the streets to gather signatures on a petition to put this law on the ballot in a public referendum. And the first thing that the Republicans did was to challenge the validity of the petitions. They got, through this petition drive, they needed something like 300,000 signatures, and they got like 800,000 signatures. There was clearly concern within the state. The Republicans challenged the validity of the petitions by focusing on the font size of the title of the petition. And that went all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court, believe it or not. Finally, we prevailed. The referendum was put on the ballot, and in November of 2012, by a huge majority, the voters in the state of Michigan voted to repeal this law. Within the next few weeks, Snyder and the Republican majority immediately passed a new emergency manager law that was broader in scope, and this time they included an appropriations rider on the bill, which under Michigan law makes that law referendum proof. So the people spoke, and the state reacted and responded and has even narrowed our rights that much more. By March of 2013, emergency managers were appointed in 11 Michigan communities, 8 of which consisted of majority African American communities. Highland Park, Benton Harbor, Detroit, Muskegon Heights, Inkster, Flint, Pontiac, River Rouge. And as you can see from the percentages over on the right side of the screen, every single one of these communities is significantly majority African American. And in addition, the total number of people affected by this law affected 52%, the majority of Michigan's entire African American population. So by March of 2013, the majority of African American people in the state of Michigan were ruled by unelected, unaccountable dictators in the form of emergency managers. Then we had 2 other communities, Ecorse and Hamtramck, and Allen Park, sorry. Now, focusing on Flint and Detroit for a moment, in addition to the percentage, the number of African Americans who were affected, the number of poor people are also disproportionately affected. As a result of years of corporate flight and corporate abandonment, particularly the auto industry since the 1960s, both Flint and Detroit, both of which were communities entirely dependent on the auto industry, now suffer some of the highest poverty rates in the state, if not the country. Michigan's poverty rate as a whole is 15.7%. Yet in Flint, 36.6% of that community lives below the poverty level, and 34.5% of Detroit lives below the poverty level. Now, let's talk about Flint for a second. While all this was going on, Flint was experiencing its series of emergency managers. And in March of 2013, the city of Flint, and I say the city of Flint, but I'm really referring to the emergency manager in the city of Flint, again, accountable to no one but the governor. We know that the emergency manager in Flint was meeting with the Michigan treasurer, who is an appointee of the governor, and Detroit's emergency manager, a man by the name of Kevin Orr. You may have heard his name in the news over the past couple of years. In collusion with these unaccountable politicians and dictators, this emergency manager named Darnell Early announces that Flint, which had been up until then purchasing its water through the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, and Flint was paying the highest rates for its water of any of DWSD's customers. And they announced, well, we're going to stop using Detroit water. We're going to build our own pipeline in the form of this Karagandhi Water Authority. But our pipeline's not going to be done until 2016, but too bad, we're going to stop using Detroit water. We have this river going through our city. We're just going to use the Flint River. Well, the reason that this decision was supposedly justifiable was it was supposed to be saving Flint $4 million a year. But there was an independent financial study done which actually disclosed that over the long run, this Karagandhi Water Authority contract was going to end up costing Flint substantially more than had it just stayed with the DWSD, which was a known clean source of water. At the same time, the decision to withdraw from Detroit also resulted simultaneously in a substantial reduction in revenue to the city of Detroit, which you may already know was just about to enter into the country's largest municipal bankruptcy in history. So, right after the enactment of the new emergency manager law, again, the National Lawyers Guild, with the Sugar Law Center for Economic and Social Justice and the Center for Constitutional Rights, filed a federal constitutional challenge to the new emergency manager law. It's referred to as Public Act 436. My office, acting pro bono on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild, is one of the lead counsel in this constitutional challenge. And in that challenge, we claimed several violations of the Constitution, both the substantive due process clause, the equal protection clause, both on the basis of race and class, a violation of the Voting Rights Act, which seemed to us to be a no-brainer since this law rips out from only majority African American communities, completely disenfranchises those communities. First Amendment, right to petition the government, and we also included a claim under the 13th Amendment, which was somewhat creative, but there is law to support that when you disenfranchise an entire community that happens to be majority African American, you are essentially recreating vestiges of slavery. Now, as the result of a motion to dismiss our case, the federal district judge granted the state's motion on all counts except for our equal protection claim. This case is currently on appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we're about to file our briefs in that case next week. Now, going back to Flint again. Between March and April of 2013, right after Detroit had its emergency manager appointed, and we filed our challenge, and the announcement was made by Flint, by the emergency manager there, to stop using Detroit's water. The Detroit Water and Sewage Department did make an offer to Flint to reduce the rates and to keep them with Detroit. While that was going on between the Detroit Water and Sewage Department and Flint, the Detroit emergency manager was fully aware that this was going to result in continued reduced revenue for the city of Detroit, and he was in the process of preparing the city of Detroit to declare bankruptcy. So he and Darnell Early, the Flint emergency manager, we know this through inside sources, were meeting with one another, and it was a perfect storm for both of them. Flint got to go into this Karagandhi Water Authority, which, by the way, several members of the Flint elected, the public officials, sat on the board of this Karagandhi Water Authority. So we have not yet uncovered who's making the money, but clearly follow the money and we'll get to the bottom of it. But meanwhile, it also set the stage for Kevin Orr in Detroit to be perfectly positioned to say, we've just lost a huge amount of more revenue, we're horribly in debt, and it justified his going into bankruptcy for the city of Detroit. And by July of 2013, that's exactly what happened. Even though when he was first appointed, he said, I'm here to prevent Detroit from going into bankruptcy, we knew all along that this was the track he was on, and in fact, this was the track he was on. Fast forward a year, April of 2014. Flint emergency manager turns off the switch from Detroit, which was clean, to the Flint River, which was poison. And I'll get back to that later. At the same time, by May of 2014, the Detroit emergency manager starts a mass campaign of mass water shutoffs to the low-income residents of Detroit. And they only went after residential customers, those least able to afford to pay. And a huge number of these people didn't even owe the money for water they were using. Many of them inherited exorbitant bills that were left by their landlords or by previous residents of that same address. And the city was having no part of negotiating any kind of affordable payment plan. Instead, they just randomly shut off tens of thousands of people's water in the city of Detroit, creating a huge public health crisis in Detroit. There was a groundswell of protest activity, and there were acts of civil disobedience in Detroit to try to stop these mass water shutoffs. And on July 14th, a group of activists got arrested in front of the private contractor, blocking their driveway to prevent those trucks from going out to shut people's water off. 9 of them were arrested, and they are now what is famously known in Detroit as the Homerick Nine. And my office is on a team of attorneys, again, pro bono, representing these activists in the criminal prosecutions. The city of Detroit is vigorously prosecuting this group of activists, and that could take a whole other hour or two just to explain that. So I won't do that today, but if you want to learn more, you can come to Cleveland on March 19th at the National Lawyers Guild Regional Conference that's happening there, where I'm going to be speaking at a workshop precisely on this case. By the summer of 2014, the bankruptcy proceedings were going in full force in the bankruptcy court in Detroit. And there was an injunctive action filed by a group of activists to try to use the bankruptcy proceeding to stop the Detroit water shutoffs from going forward. And after a 1 week long evidentiary hearing, Judge Rhodes, the bankruptcy judge, found in no uncertain terms that when you cut someone's water off, when you deprive a community of clean water, you create imminent harm, you create irreparable harm. And he found that on the record. And he identified those harms as being life-threatening to people who are deprived of access to water. Nonetheless, on September 29, 2014, Judge Rhodes refused to protect against this harm, looking only at the bottom line: follow the money. He paid no attention to the fact that commercial customers, who the city was not going after at all, owed millions and millions of dollars in unpaid water bills. Instead, he found that the city was allowed to continue its war against poor people in the city of Detroit, because without getting those bills paid, it seriously threatens the revenue to the city of Detroit. And that was his finding. That finding, by the way, is currently on appeal as well to the U.S. Court of Appeals. So now we go to Flint, the final insult. Back to April 25th, 2014. By April of 2014, the state Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the city of Flint officials and the emergency managers were all fully aware that by switching the water source to the Flint River, there would be serious problems health-wise and, just health-wise. They knew from independent studies that were done in 2011 that using the Flint River as the source of water to this community was dangerous. Nonetheless, this emergency manager, with the full knowledge of the state going all the way up to the governor's office, turned that switch off and turned the Flint River on without even bothering to introduce into this known dangerous source and of toxic water what everybody knew who knew anything about safe water, without using any anti-corrosive treatment to that water. And that became the death knell to this city. And the treatment is called, it's phosphates. And what the phosphates do is they take water that's known to be corrosive and they treat it in a way that when the water is going through the pipes, especially antiquated pipes and old pipes that are either made of lead or have lead lining or are welded together with lead, when corrosive water interacts with lead or any heavy metals, those heavy metals start to fall apart and they get leached into the water. It's a well-known scientific fact. Everybody who knows anything about water safety knows this. The emergency manager, did not bother making sure that the water coming from the Flint River was properly treated. And this picture right there, these are all of the guys from Flint, and led by the emergency manager, celebrating the use of, here we are, Flint River water, yay, we're going to save all this money. By the way, it would have cost Flint less than $100 every 3 months to treat this water with the phosphates that it needed, but they made the decision not to do that. So the cover-up begins. Immediately upon the switch, there were reactions to this water. The water was horribly discolored. You can see from the top of there, that's the color of the water that was coming into people's homes. It smelled bad. People were having severe skin reactions, rashes. They were losing their hair. And it was discovered by the MDEQ, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the state regulatory agency that's supposed to protect people's environmental rights, knew that they discovered there was, at a minimum, they discovered elevated levels of E. coli and coliform bacteria that was beginning to immediately started making people sick. So they treated that bacteria with chlorine. By the fall of 2014, because of the use of high amounts of chlorine, a byproduct of chlorine is this chemical agent called total trihalomethanes, TTHM. This is a known carcinogen. It is known to make people sick. It is known over the long run to cause cancer. By the fall of 2014, the state knew that there were elevated levels of TTHM, and they did not tell anyone until the beginning of 2015, when they issued a boil water alert to get at the TTHM problem. Between June and December of 2014, and this is where everything really started going crazy, through the testing that was done by MDEQ, when they switched over to the water under the federal EPA lead and copper rules, they were required to do random testing every 6 months, and they were supposed to be testing those homes that were identified as being the most high risk. That is, every city is supposed to know which homes have lead service lines going from the main service line where the water comes from to the service lines that go from the main line into the people's homes. And every city is supposed to know which of those service lines have lead in them. Well, Flint had not been keeping track of this since the 60s, so they did not have a clue, and they didn't bother to try to have a clue. Instead, they manipulated the test results, and even by manipulating the testing process, they still, between June and December, were starting to receive extremely elevated lead levels found in these homes that they were testing. And they did not tell anyone. And we've got now the tens of thousands of emails that, through the political pressure that has been put on the state, now have been released. The emails that were going between the MDEQ to the governor's office, from the emergency managers to the MDEQ, it's mind-blowing how insidious this whole process was. They knew they were getting these elevated lead levels, and they were basically saying, we have to cover this up. We have to calm people down. We can't let them know about this because they'll go crazy. It wasn't until the fall of 2015, and only through the efforts of some grassroots activists within the city of Flint, who got the EPA involved, who got Virginia Tech scientists involved, and who got a pediatrician in Flint involved, that it finally became public that there was serious problems with lead in this water. By the fall of 2014, the MDEQ and the governor's office became aware that not only was there a serious problem with elevated lead levels, but people were starting to contract Legionnaire's disease at unprecedented levels. And they were immediately aware that there was at least a possible connection between this filthy water that was going into hospitals, schools, libraries, and people's homes, and this disease. That was actively hidden from the public until January of 2016. This past January was the first time that that knowledge was made known to the public. Through all of the efforts that were going on in Flint to fight against this toxic water, from the grassroots level on up, there was an organization called What Are We Fighting For? WATER, We Fighting For, a grassroots community organization who was just, they were constantly making noise. They were constantly trying to put pressure on the powers that be. And the response from the state in July of 2015 from the spokesperson for the director of the MDEQ, hand in hand with the emergency manager, dictator of Flint, relax. This water's perfectly safe to drink. He picked up a glass. See, I'm drinking it. And he drinks it. This statement was made, known that it was a lie. Their own tests had shown that the lead levels in Flint's water had nearly doubled between the second half of 2014 and the first half of 2015. And when I say doubled, I'm saying more than doubled. I mean, the safe level under EPA standards for lead levels in water is 15 parts per billion. And that's not safe, but that's tolerable. They were finding lead levels in people's water coming into their homes in the thousands. And some homes had in the tens of thousands, 27,000 parts per billion. There were children who were being tested for lead levels in their blood. The tolerable lead level, according to most doctors, no lead level is safe. But the tolerable level for lead is 5 parts per billion. And there were children who were being tested at 20, 25, 40 parts per billion. That's lead poisoning. There were children and adults being poisoned by this lead-laced water. But at the same time, the state saw fit. All the state employees who worked in the city of Flint, by the summer of 2015, were all being provided with bottled water. Okay, now, I'm going to show you a quick This says it all, really. Oh, sorry.
We knew that this emergency manager law was undemocratic. We knew it was unprecedented, but we never dreamed that we would be faced with not being able to use our municipal water.
Three, two, one.
With the push of a button, the water valve from Detroit was shut off, and the city of Flint's main source of water is now the Flint River.
When we heard it on the news that we might be drinking Flint water, might be going to that, we all thought it was a joke. Everybody knows how gross the Flint River is. I think there was a Guinness Book of World Records broken for how many shopping carts were in one body of water.
Here's the Flint. Here's the Flint.
Here it is.
And then when, of course, the snow thawed, there was 2 bodies found in it.
Some residents are wondering, will we see a change?
That's one of our clients, by the way. She's one of the plaintiffs.
My water's been brown since the switch.
That's
The
Leanne
work that has
Walters.
gone into preparing the city of Flint to eliminate its dependence on Detroit Water and Sewer Department. That's a major step, a huge step in the right direction, because it now gives you the opportunity to better control the cost.
Who pays the highest price in Genesee County for water?
You have older women and older men out here, and they're trying to survive just off of their pensions.
There's no relief for your bills, you're going to get shut off, and then everybody knows. You lose your water for 90 days, they cap your sewer, condemn your home, take your children.
On one side was the city of Flint's finances, and on the other side was the health of the citizens of Flint.
We've had 3 or 4 boil water advisories.
The rashes, the hair loss, the muscle stiffness, the soreness.
My family broke out in a rash that we were told looks like scabies, but it wasn't scabies.
For instance, right now, we don't baptize. If we baptize, we have to go outside of the city of Flint.
They had to shut off all the water in all the public schools.
The minute we failed that first test, we should have known.
We ran into some bumps, but what did we do when that happened?
Didn't tell us.
January.
You waited. What we do about that? We started immediately to address the problem.
Without telling the public.
We're telling you now.
And when you get to the point where you feel like it don't matter what I say or do, they're going to do what they want to do anyway, that's a sad day for America.
Flint residents have nothing to worry about.
Those levels are back to normal.
If you don't believe that particular test, that's your prerogative. This is a democracy.
How is this democracy?
No, it's not.
Well, it's as much as we have for now.
Now, when he spoke, he had no power. The mayor, the city council had no power.
Now we've done research. That's what's on our website. Link after study after result.
We have an old infrastructure. When you change your source water, you disrupt the biofilm that's already built up in those pipes. The pipes are eating themselves from the inside out.
Come to find out I have hemolytic anemia, which now we find is caused by copper toxicity.
In April, beginning of April, we found out my child had lead poisoning, and that's when the city came out and shut my water off. On Detroit, we didn't have these issues.
Put us back on Detroit until you can figure out what you're doing and prove to us beyond a doubt that this water is clean and safe.
Detroit water, can we hook up again to the Detroit water? Great question, everybody's asking, can we hook up? We can if we have a money tree. You'd be sorry if we hooked up on that, so that's the answer to that question.
Do you live in Flint?
You are literally in a fight for your life right now.
I'm terrified of what, the outcome of this, the aftermath of this could be, neurologically, for my children.
We are being saddled with this toxic water because we under a toxic system under emergency management.
Sir, you're killing us, sir. Please. I'm not killing anybody. Sir,
We feel like we live in a third world country. We're getting poisoned water and we have no rights.
There was the person who made that film is an investigative reporter named Kurt Guyette, who works for the ACLU. And as a result of his work, that's what blew the lid off this series of lies and secrets and cover-ups that were going on as high up as the governor's office. There's a pediatrician whose name you might recognize from the publicity that's been going on, named Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. She's the director of pediatric residency program at the public hospital in Flint. And when she learned that there were these elevated lead levels during the summer of 2015, she became quite alarmed. And she started testing her patients. And what she found was this dramatic spike in children's blood lead levels. And she made it public. And she came under horrible attack from the state governor's office. They tried to discredit her. They tried to make her look like she didn't know what she was talking about. They said, we're going to do our own tests. And she's wrong. She's wrong. Well, they did their own tests, and at that point, they had to say, oh, she's right. And it was only as a result of her work. What she has to talk about is just what the dangers are from exposure to lead in water. She has to assume every child in Flint has been exposed since 2014 to lead water. The impact of lead poisoning, we don't even know for years. But what we do know from the history of studying lead poisoning is that within 5 years, we're going to see kids who need early intervention and special education services. In 10 years, they're going to see lots of kids being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. Within 15 to 20 years, we're going to see an elevated level of violent and aggressive behavior by people who suffered from lead poisoning as children. So now, with the lid blown off the lead cover-up, now the state is, of course, Governor Snyder gets on television at his State of the State address last month and says, let's not talk about blame. Let's go forward. Let's make it right. Well, he's still not making it right. But the U.S. Department of Justice and the Michigan Attorney General have now launched criminal investigations into the wrongs that were done. And who here has not heard of Michael Moore? He is from Flint, and he's been very outspoken about this crisis. And he says, and he gets right to the heart of it, this is a racial crime. If this were happening in another country, we would call it ethnic cleansing. If this were happening in a white, wealthy community anywhere in this country, well, it just wouldn't be happening in a white, wealthy community anywhere in this country. So let's talk about accountability. There have been numerous lawsuits filed now. As you can imagine, there are law firms swooping in from all over the country. My law firm has joined in partnership with another civil rights firm in Detroit, with a local attorney in Flint, and with a number of major class action litigation firms to file the first class action lawsuit in November of 2015, in which we are asserting numerous violations of the U.S. Constitution in that case. Who here has heard of the Civil Rights Statute 42 U.S.C. Section 1983? Just a handful of you. Well, the basis of these lawsuits is back on the heels of the end of slavery, Congress passed a law that said individual people who are victims of constitutional violations at the hands of government actors, people acting under color of state law, have a private right of action to hold those government actors liable for damages or equitable relief. And 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 is the heart of all of the civil rights litigation that you hear or read about throughout the country today, challenging police misconduct, government misconduct, and so forth. And that's what my firm specializes in. So we have three basic theories of liability that we are pursuing in this case. Under the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment, the courts have recognized that the state or the government, while it may not have an affirmative duty to protect against harm in a general sense, it is not permitted to create the harm that occurs while acting under color of state law. And that's called a state-created danger. We also have a claim that goes under the concept of the right to bodily integrity. And that's another basis for accountability when government actors violate your rights and intrude upon your own personal body. They're not allowed to do that. And for example, the most well-known example would be in a school setting, for example. If a teacher sexually abuses a child in school, the supervisory administrators are obligated to take steps to protect that child, because that child has a fundamental constitutional right to bodily integrity. And when you're assaulted, that right is violated. And in Flint, magnify that 100,000-fold. When you are poisoned by your government, then that is the supreme invasion of your bodily integrity. And we are going to be adding, very shortly, an equal protection claim, both claiming a violation for race discrimination and also economic discrimination. And this is the basis of the law, this case in the Sixth Circuit, which governs Detroit, Kellstrom versus the City of Columbus. I just summarized that concept to you. The standard of liability for establishing a state-created danger is that the plaintiff must show that the individual agent acting under color of law with deliberate indifference to a known or obvious danger, and that the actions taken created or increased such danger facing the plaintiff. A good graphic example of a state-created danger case is the police pull over somebody for drunk driving, and there's a passenger in the car. And the police take the drunk driver into custody. It's the middle of the night, it's dark out, there are no lights, and the passenger is also intoxicated. This is my hypothetical here. The police impound the car and take the driver into custody and say to the passenger, "See ya, you're on your own." And then the passenger gets hit by a car. That passenger has been the victim of a state-created danger and has a cause of action under 1983. This is the basis of the right to bodily integrity, also citing Kellstrom versus the City of Columbus. By invading one's right to bodily integrity, the state strips the very essence of personhood. And that's the principle under which we are proceeding in our civil rights claims in this case. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment protects laws and the application of laws that invidiously discriminate between similarly situated individuals or between groups of persons in the exercise of their fundamental rights. And what we are asserting in our equal protection claim, or will be asserting, is that the state acted as it did in the city of Flint because it knew it could do it and get away with it, because it was dealing with a group of people who were dispensable, disenfranchised, minorities, and poor people. The elements of an equal protection violation under the 14th Amendment: a consistent pattern of actions by the decision-making body that disparately impacted members of a particular class, historical background of those decisions, the sequence of events leading up to the particular decision being challenged, and contemporary statements on the record or in minutes of meetings that show what their intent or motives were. Under the Equal Protection Clause, you have to show not only disparate impact, but you have to show that there was a motive that was, or an intent that was motivated by a discriminatory mindset. And the seminal case under this area of law is the U.S. Supreme Court case of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation. We also have a second case that we have filed in the Michigan Court of Claims. And there is this doctrine called governmental immunity. Who here has not heard of this doctrine? Governmental immunity. Under state law, governments are protected by a very broad scope of governmental immunity. And in fact, you can't sue the state in a regular court because they're absolutely immune. However, there's a special court that's been set up called the Court of Claims, and I would suspect Indiana probably has a similar setup. I'm not sure. But Michigan has a Court of Claims. And our Constitution also has a due process clause. And under the Court of Claims Act and under a case called Smith versus Department of Public Health, a victim of a violation of the Michigan Constitution can sue the state directly for damages as a result of customs policies or practices that violate one's rights under the Michigan Constitution. And that's what we are alleging in the Court of Claims case that we filed just on January 15th of this year. We've named the state of Michigan, we've named Governor Snyder, we've named the MDEQ as in its agency, and we've named the individual emergency managers acting in their official capacities. And then finally, we have filed a third class action in state court in the regular county circuit court against the individual actors, alleging just Michigan common law claims against them for gross negligence and for intentional infliction of emotional distress. And on that note, I've got several slides that go into potential criminal liability, but that was put together by someone else. And I'm going to leave those slides with Kevin here, Miss Professor Fry.
Oh, no professor.
Okay.
Honorary professor.
To make available to you guys. But I'm just going to stop right now and use the remaining time to be able to answer whatever questions you might have. Just to sum up, however, I hope that through this presentation you've gotten a flavor for just how deep and how broad the crisis that is going on in Michigan really is, and how inherently dangerous we are, what dangerous times we are in. And Michigan is not alone. We are like the canary in the coal mine. And it is extremely important for those of you who see yourselves as future lawyers in our what should be a constitutional and democratic society. We have our work cut out for us, and we need more social justice people's lawyers than ever. And so I would love to talk to any of you who might be interested in going down that path to give you some idea of how you can do it and be able to look at yourselves in the mirror at night and also survive as lawyers. So I hope that this talk has helped inspire you to maybe move in that direction. So any questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Mike. Before I ask my question, I just want to say but I've been following this story. I had an idea of this stuff happening. Kind of a platitude at this point, but this is top of my question because
Oh no, it was January 19th, 2016.
a story on the Detroit Free Press that reported that I guess that's sort of an eerie.
Well, you're welcome. We'll see how it plays itself out. But, you know, those of us who are working on this team are motivated by a deep sense of justice. And the wrongs that have been done are just mind-blowing. In the 34 years that I've been practicing law, I have never seen, I've always known, I've always suspected that there was this level of corruption and dishonesty in many of our governmental institutions, but the volume of evidence that proves just how evil it really is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And, you know, I don't want to plagiarize, but there is a candidate out there who keeps talking about the need for a political revolution. And I'm telling you, if there is a need for a political revolution in this country, if there ever was, it's now more than ever. Any other questions? Yes. Sure. That's a really good question, because we are actually exploring filing a separate Federal Tort Claim Act case directly against the EPA for what they knew, what obligations they had, and how they failed those obligations. There is an EPA research investigator by the name of Miguel del Toral, whose name you might have read about in the press, who way early on, I think it was June of 2014, was alerted by one of these women, Leanne Walters, about the problems she was having with the lead that was discovered in her home and in her children's blood. And he did his own investigation and circulated a memo saying, there's a serious problem in Flint, and they are not treating their water with phosphates, and people are going to be poisoned. There needs to be action. And that memo was circulated within the EPA. It was sent to the MDEQ, and a copy was given to Leanne Walters. The EPA buried it. The MDEQ called Mr. Del Toral a rogue employee not to be listened to. But Leanne Walters took it public. And it's through that memo that she sent to this scientist in Virginia, Professor Mark Edwards, that alerted him to, this is a problem, I'm going up there. He is the nation's leading expert in lead levels and safe drinking water. He made a beeline up to Flint. He started doing his own testing, and he was blown away by the dangerousness of this water system. And it was through his efforts and the efforts of Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha that actually forced this into the public, and the investigative journalism of Kurt Guyette. The three of them were single-handedly responsible for bringing this open. So yes, we believe that there may well be culpability on the part of the EPA for its muteness, its failure to intervene when it should have. Yes. Absolutely. I've been fighting the emergency manager law since 2010. We've been yelling and screaming along with the grassroots community, the unions, the activists, the civil rights activists. This is a dangerous law, and we are not the only state that is facing this serious assault on democracy. But it has fallen on deaf ears, both publicly and in the courts, until Flint. But New Jersey, Puerto Rico, I know, are two locations in which Kevin Orr, the Detroit emergency manager, has been hired by those communities to explore initiating emergency manager type laws in those states and colonies. So yes, this is just every single state that's facing potential financial distress within their communities is ripe for the passage of this type of a law. Yes. Yes. It's every union that has a contract with a municipality or a school district. So the UAW, for example, it's not a public union, but it has locals that do represent public employees. So every single labor organization, union that represents public employees, those contracts are they're worthless when it comes to the takeover by an emergency manager. What's going on now is that in October of 2015, when Snyder got caught red-handed, both lying and aware of this horrible dangers, he personally took the step to have the water. He used state money to switch back to the properly treated Detroit water. However, there was so much damage done to the infrastructure of this antiquated system in Flint that even today, what happens is when you've got the phosphates in the water, which the Detroit water does, it has these buffers that latch on to the pipes. Like here's the pipe. If you're looking at it, you know, the water's, you're looking at it head on. And the lead is leaching off the edges of the pipe into the water. What the phosphates do is they create this little wall of protection around the edge of the pipe so the water doesn't affect all these heavy metals that are lined around the inside, the inner wall of the pipe. And when you've taken that protection away, all the stuff, it's just the corrosive nature of the water. And Flint River has the most corrosive, it's highly corrosive because it's so filthy. And the lead, copper, and zinc just leach into the water. And when you reintroduce the phosphates back into the water, it starts to rebuild the wall, but it takes normally 3 to 4 months to fully protect the wall of the pipe again. It has now been, let's see, they switched over in October, November, December, January, February. We're into March, 5 months, and they just released a new test. More than 10% of Flint's homes are still experiencing elevated lead levels in their water running into their homes. And so they're still being told, don't drink the water. They still have to pay for the water, but they can't drink it, they can't bathe in it, they can't cook with it, they can't do laundry with it, and they're all dependent on bottled water still. So the effort right now, and the newly elected mayor, who is a wonderful person, has been, her major campaign right now is, you got to rebuild this infrastructure. The people in this community will never trust this water again until you rebuild this infrastructure. And there's a way to do it that's been proven to be relatively low cost, like $50 million instead of $1.5 billion. And the state is continuing, Snyder personally is continuing to say, let's take our time, let's see how this works. You know, Professor Edwards says that this phosphate treatment is going to protect these pipes. It's just not happening. The water is still dangerous at dangerously high levels. And so that's where they're at loggerheads right now to force the state to come in and do the right thing. Part of the relief we are demanding is an injunctive part of our case, forcing the state to rebuild this infrastructure. There's a separate lawsuit that's been filed by the Natural Resources Defense Council and the ACLU under the Safe Drinking Water Act that's exclusively limited to demanding immediate rebuilding of the infrastructure. Yes?
Early claimed that the local city council asked the transfer of the water from Detroit. I recognize that the emergency manager law was in effect, so I just want to give you a discrepancy of
That's a good question. He lied. Big surprise. The city council had no say in this switch. However, the emergency manager and the state treasurer and the governor all lobbied heavily with the Flint City Council, convincing them that, oh, you're going to save so much money over the long run, and this is totally safe. So it's totally in your interest to switch to this Karagandhi Pipe Water Authority. So yeah, it is true that there was a vote taken where a majority of the city council said, okay, well, it sounds good to us, we'll vote in favor of it. But it was a complete straw vote because they had no authority to decide one way or the other. And in retrospect, they're all kicking themselves because they were lied to. Except for there were a handful of Flint officials who actually, like the head of the Flint Department of Public Works is the CEO for the Karagandhi Water Authority. So connect the dots. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The phosphates that were reintroduced into the water system help keep the heavy metals from leaching into the water, which I suppose theoretically means that the pipe now becomes safe.
Theoretically.
But that does not take care of the organisms that cause Legionnaires' disease.
That is true. That is absolutely true. And up until this week, there was, of course, continuing massive denial of any connection between this water and Legionnaire's disease. Now, however, the organisms that carried the Legionnaire's disease were from the Flint River. They're not using the Flint River anymore. They have switched back to Detroit. So the water coming in is clean again, and it's properly treated. It's not as corrosive, and it doesn't carry those dangers. But the problem is the harm that's been done to the infrastructure makes it impossible for that water to be safe once it reaches individual homes.
And how much does that process that you described over here, how much does that affect the inside diameter of the pipe and the pressure problem created by that?
I don't think so. From everything I've heard, that's not an issue that's come up as one of concern. I mean, we're talking a really thin layer. It's a buffer. It's like a film, a very thin film that simply creates a buffer between the heavy metals and the water flowing through the pipe. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. That is an excellent question, and as far as I'm concerned, it can't happen too soon. And I think probably at this point, the majority of people in Michigan share that view. But the way that the inner workings of those types of investigations happen, we've got dual tracks going. The governor himself, or the attorney general, a guy by the name of Schuette, who is equally as right-wing as Governor Snyder is, and also vying to run for governor himself, has appointed a separate task force, a private task force, headed by a former prosecutor to investigate potential criminal liability under state law. And as I think I mentioned, the Justice Department has, through Obama's administration, has initiated its own federal investigation. And, you know, it's also political. I just don't know how long it's going to take. However long it takes, it's probably going to be too long. Yes? I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, that's a very good point. In Detroit last fall, the United Nations actually sent a team of raconteurs or rapporteurs to do its own international human rights investigation of the public health crisis that was being created by the mass water shutoffs in Detroit, and found that there were such violations and that there were international human rights implications triggered by what's going on in Detroit. So absolutely, there are very extensive international human rights implications, and I think the United Nations is or has already sent a team to Flint. Unfortunately, our courts in the United States are a little slow in recognizing the validity of international human rights law. So it's extremely valuable politically, but not enforceable in our courts. Any other questions? So what, one more question? Or are we way behind schedule?
If you have more questions, please come and speak to her personally. Besides that, we have ran out of time. Thank you for coming out. We also have materials related to the National Lawyers Guild if you're interested in joining. She is a vice president of the Michigan chapter of the National Lawyers Guild.
Join the Lawyers Guild.
Please join the Lawyers Guild if you want to be a part of the fight, including the undergrads, because you don't have to be a lawyer to join the National Lawyers Guild. Thank you.